Hello and welcome to this podcast. My name is Peter Mazurek and I'm the author of a book called Modern Catholic Concerns. This is the book. I'm presenting this series of podcasts to review some of the key issues that I've raised in my book. The first issue I want to deal with in this podcast is the question of whether or not we have an immortal soul. I deal with that issue in section 1.1.7 of my book under the heading of the primary assumption, where I discussed this issue for about 5 pages, but I did not give the arguments against making this assumption. I treated it as an assumption because I believe that if anyone has already made the decision that we do not have an immortal soul, that it would be unlikely for them to be reading my book, and also because I didn't think the issue was particularly controversial. However, the purpose of my book is to provide my readers with information both for and against the issues that I've raised, with a consideration of the strengths and weaknesses of the arguments and evidence. Even though I have treated this issue as an assumption, I think that it does warrant a consideration of the arguments for and against with their strengths and weaknesses, because this issue underlies the whole of what is in my book, and in particular the issue of whether or not God exists. Also, about half of the 8 billion people on this planet are atheists. It does not make sense to me for an atheist to believe that we have an immortal soul, but not to believe that God exists. Therefore, I now consider that the issue is substantially controversial. It is a threshold issue, and what I say in this podcast is essentially a supplement to what I've said in my book. The issue is whether we have an immortal soul. I've created a flow chart to enable me to talk through this and to give you an overview of how what I have to say hangs together, and that should appear on my website, linked up with the series of podcasts also referred to on my website. And that website is petermazurek.com. For listeners of the podcast who are interested in having a look at the flowchart. The flowchart starts with the dictionary definition of the soul, which is as follows: the spirit or immaterial part of man, the seat of human personality, intellect, will, and emotions, regarded as an entity that survives the body after death. The source of this definition is the Collins Concise Dictionary, 3rd edition, 1995. So from this, it's clear that most people believe that we do have an immortal soul, but many people do not think that our souls are immortal. In other words, they think that this life is all that there is. So the issue is whether our souls are immortal or not. There is evidence in support of the assumption and evidence and arguments against the assumption that our souls are immortal. Let us start by looking at the arguments against our souls being immortal. An excellent representation of this argument is essentially set out in a book called Soul Searching, Human Nature and Supernatural Belief by Nicholas Humphrey, published by Chatto and Windus, London, 1995. That's this book. The position that Mr. Humphrey takes is that he is an admitted atheist and that he does not believe that there is anything supernatural, and that when he dies, that's all there is. Essentially, his argument is that from all the proper scientific experiments that have been done, there is no persuasive proof that anything supernatural exists. In his book, he also considers a lot of supposedly supernatural things that occur in our life, such as extrasensory perception, miracles, ghosts, and some other supernatural phenomena. His argument is essentially that these occurrences are only evidenced by anecdotal evidence and that there is no scientifically based proof of the existence of anything supernatural. The strength of his argument is that it is true. State-of-the-art science involves experiments designed to prove a hypothesis or theory that is being presented for testing. For such proof to be acceptable, the experiment must be repeatable and the results consistent with the initial experiment. He argues that scientific method has not been able to establish any persuasive evidence that anything supernatural exists. The weakness of his argument is that it is logically flawed. It is flawed in that the failure of scientific experiments to prove that something does exist does not amount to proof that it does not exist. The possibility is that perhaps one day scientists will devise experiments that may prove that the supernatural does exist, although science has not been able to do that to date. A second weakness of his argument is that he rejects all of the anecdotal evidence that the supernatural exists simply because it is not scientific proof. We can accept that some things claimed to be supernatural are fraudulent, presented by people for some personal gain or out of a sense of mischief. Other supernatural phenomena may well be delusional or simply observational errors. However, there are still many instances of things that have happened which appear to be supernatural that remain unexplained by science, and many of these are presented by people with reputations for integrity who have nothing to gain from giving their accounts of such events. A third weakness is that it is unreasonable to expect the physical sciences to prove the existence of spiritual things. We all know that we have emotions like love, etc., and we may even know how that or what part of our brain produces these emotions by releasing dopamine and other chemicals. But we also know that love is an abstract thing and that there is no physical thing like an atom or molecule that can be identified as the love particle. The consequence of belief that our souls are merely mortal is that God does not exist, or if he exists, his existence is irrelevant. There is a proviso to this, which is, if God does exist, does he interfere in human affairs? What I mean by this is that does God in some way reward people who live their lives in accordance with his will, or punish those who do not? If God does exist and he does reward good deeds or otherwise interferes in human affairs, the consequence of that is that a person who believes that his soul is merely mortal might choose to live in accordance with God's will in order to obtain a better life. The alternative, is that if God does exist, he does not interfere in human affairs, which leads to the conclusion that the existence of God is irrelevant. And if the existence of God is irrelevant, then the logical consequence of that belief is that a person should become a devout hedonist. What I mean by this is that a hedonist leads a totally selfish life, completely regardless of God's laws. Let us now consider the argument in support of our souls being immortal. In support of this issue, I can refer you to a book called Journey of Souls by Michael Newton, PhD, 5th Revised Edition, Llewellyn Publications, 2023. That's the book. This is a book by a practicing psychiatrist who has devised new techniques of hypnotism to question his patients about what they have experienced in the afterlife. His book documents interviews with 29 patients in which they all give accounts of their experience after dying or near-death experiences. Their accounts are clearly edited in order to be more readable, but there is a striking similarity between the various accounts from which Newton has extrapolated the existence of an afterlife in the nature of a school for souls, basically involving reincarnation. The book is evidence that there is something after death, but it is not necessarily persuasive or even scientific evidence of reincarnation. In the literature and mass media of today, there are many accounts of near-death experiences in which the narrator tells of moving through some sort of tunnel to a light at the end where they encounter beings in the afterlife. This does not provide evidence of reincarnation or some sort of school for souls. Nevertheless, Mr. Newton's book is evidence of what his patients have said to him, which is consistent with the argument that we do have an immortal soul. His book appears to be honestly and competently presented. If we accept that our souls are immortal, then the next question that logically arises is, where do our souls come from? There are several possible answers, but the main option appears to be our souls are an accident of evolution, or God created our souls. If our souls are an accident of evolution, then the existence of God is again irrelevant, leading to the conclusion that we should become a devout hedonist. The argument in support are as follows. If we come to the conclusion that God created our souls, then clearly we are accountable to Him for how we live our lives. Pardon me a moment. And if we are accountable to Him for how we live our lives, then we should consider whether we want to have paradise in the next life or whether we are prepared to accept hell for a life lived contrary to God's commandments and laws. Another aspect of support for the conclusion that we do have immortal souls is our own experience of extrasensory perception. Many of us will have had some sort of minor and inexplicable episode in our lives of what is called extrasensory perception, although clearly and certainly not enough to amount to scientific proof. In our world, there are many ghost stories. There are Ouija boards and mediums and prophets like Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce. There are seances and miracles, many of which remain unexplained. As already indicated, we cannot simply disregard all of these things simply on the basis that some of them are clearly fraudulent or delusional. Yet another area of evidence of the immortality of our souls is from the tenets of the various religions. The Catholic faith has a documented history of exorcisms, which is evidence of the existence of supernatural evil beings, and also miracles, which is evidence of supernatural intervention in human affairs. And its teachings assume the existence of an immortal soul. Indeed, in the New Testament, the meaning of the word gospel is good news, and that good news given to us by Jesus is that we do have an immortal soul, and that if we live our lives in accordance with how God wants us to live our lives, then we can gain paradise with Him for eternity. And if we live a totally hedonistic life and offend God, then He will punish us with eternal damnation. In addition, we can look at the history of the world and as it is embodied in mythology. In Greek mythology, there was Hades, who judged people who have died by balancing their good works against their bad works and casting them into hell if the bad outweighed the good. In Norse mythology, we have Odin and Valhalla, which is the heaven for the brave Viking warriors. In Egyptian mythology, we have various gods who also weigh the good deeds of the souls of people who have died against their bad deeds and deal with them accordingly. Although we call it mythology, it is certainly likely that the people who lived in those days actually believed these deities and how they worked. Similarly, the history of many other peoples contain traditional beliefs about the existence of the soul and the afterlife. So what we can draw from this is that many people over the centuries have believed in an immortal soul. The weakness of the argument for the existence of the immortal soul is precisely those reasons given by Mr. Humphrey in his book, that there is no scientifically reliable evidence that we have an immortal soul. The strength of the arguments that our souls are immortal is that we cannot simply ignore the vast amount of anecdotal evidence and religious beliefs of many people over many hundreds of years. In summary, there are many people in the world who believe that this life is all that there is, because there is no scientific evidence that persuades them that there is anything more. There is anecdotal evidence that supernatural events have occurred. Some of this evidence is fraudulent and some is for various reasons unreliable. But there remains a vast number of events that remain unexplained involving reputable people. In short, there is no compelling evidence one way or the other, and every individual must decide for himself or herself what to believe. What I can leave you with is this. The issue of whether we have an immortal soul is important because it is personal. We are intelligent, self-aware human beings, and we should have a clear view of what we are. This is not some esoteric issue for philosophers and theologians. And it is important because it has consequences as to how we live our lives, in that if we accept the proposition that we have an immortal soul, then there is accountability for how we live our lives. And if we do not believe that we have an immortal soul, then there is no accountability for how we live our lives. As I've said, there is no compelling evidence either way, so we are free to choose what to believe. Many people who consider this issue will not be persuaded that we do have an immortal soul, nor will they be persuaded that we do not have an immortal soul. To assist in resolving this dilemma, I suggest considering the consequences of making either choice, and that choice ends up being the wrong choice. Thus, if you believe that we have an immortal soul, and that therefore God exists, and you live your life in accordance with God's commandments, you may gain paradise in the next life. If God does not exist, then you have lost nothing. If you believe that our souls are only mortal, and that God does not exist, and that decision is correct, then all you have gained is having been able to live a selfish life. But if you live the selfish life and God does exist, then you will be accountable to him, which may result in eternity in hell. If you're interested in further readings on this topic, I can refer you to a book called Soul, an Anthology, Readings from Socrates to Ray Charles, edited by Phil Cousineau. That's published by Thorson's, 1995. Another book is Paranormal, Caught on Film, published by F&W Publications, 2008. That's this book. There's a lot of photographs in that, of course. And another one is also by F&W Publications in 2007, called Ghosts Caught on Film. I hope that you have acquired some information from this podcast, and I invite your comments and questions. The further podcasts in this series will be issued approximately at intervals of 4 to 6 weeks, and I thank you for your attention.